What would you do if you stumbled upon a secret that changed everything you thought you knew about your past? Imagine walking into a place filled with grandeur and shadows, a mansion so vast it seems to hold more than just rooms and hallways. A mansion that hides whispers of a life once lived, ties once broken, and connections buried deep beneath layers of silence. This is where our story begins, in a world where nothing is as it seems, and every corner turned reveals another piece of a puzzle waiting to be solved. It starts with a single photograph, one small clue that unravels a lifetime of secrets. Secrets that will bring together strangers bound by fate, force them to confront their deepest regrets, and ultimately lead them to discover what it truly means to belong. Are you ready? Because once we step inside the Donovan estate, there's no turning back. The truth is waiting, but are you prepared to face it? Let's find out. The Donovan estate loomed like a fortress on the hill, its towering spires piercing through the gray clouds that hung low over the town. It was a place of wealth and solitude, where whispers of secrets seemed to echo in every empty corridor. For Lily Harris, this mansion would become both her refuge and her mystery, a world she never imagined stepping into when she accepted the job as a maid. Lily had always been a fighter. Life hadn't given her much, but it had given her Tyler, her bright-eyed, curious 8-year-old son who loved asking questions about everything under the sun. They lived modestly in a small apartment downtown, scraping by on whatever odd jobs came their way. But lately, things had gotten tougher. The bills were piling up, and Lily knew she needed something more stable if they were going to keep their heads above water. That's how she ended up here, standing at the massive oak doors of the Donovan estate, clutching her worn leather bag tightly in one hand while holding Tyler's hand with the other. When Mrs. Carter, the stern head housekeeper, greeted them at the door, Lily felt an immediate chill run down her spine. Mrs. Carter wasn't unkind, exactly, just strict, her sharp eyes missing nothing as she sized Lily up from head to toe. "You're punctual," Mrs. Carter said curtly, nodding toward Lily before glancing briefly at Tyler. "And you brought your boy. Fine. He can stay out of trouble in the East Wing while you work." Tyler didn't seem fazed by Mrs. Carter's tone. Instead, his wide blue eyes darted around the grand foyer, taking in the crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and sweeping staircase. "Mom, this place is huge," he whispered excitedly, tugging at her sleeve. Lily forced a smile, though her stomach churned with unease. Something about the mansion felt wrong. Not just because of its cold opulence, but because there was an emptiness here, an absence of warmth or life, that made her skin prickle. Mrs. Carter led Lily to the staff quarters first, explaining her duties in clipped sentences. Dusting antiques, polishing silverware, scrubbing floors until they gleamed. It was hard work, but Lily didn't mind. Hard work was all she'd ever known. Still, as she moved through the mansion, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, not by Mrs. Carter or anyone else, but by the house itself. Its shadows seemed to stretch longer than they should, and the silence between footsteps was almost deafening. It wasn't until late afternoon, after hours of cleaning, that Lily stumbled upon the photograph. She was tidying up the library, a cavernous room lined floor to ceiling with ancient books, when she noticed a dusty frame lying face down on one of the shelves. Curious, she picked it up and wiped away the grime. What she saw made her heart stop. In the photo stood two men, smiling warmly at the camera. One was unmistakably Mark Donovan, younger, yes, with softer features and a hint of joy in his eyes that Lily doubted still existed, but the resemblance was undeniable. And then there was the other man. Tall, broad-shouldered, with kind brown eyes and a familiar grin. Her breath caught in her throat. "David," she murmured, her fingers trembling against the glass. The man in the photo looked exactly like her late husband. Exactly. Same crooked smile, same unruly hair, same easygoing charm that had won her heart years ago. But that was impossible. David had died 3 years ago in a car accident. He'd never mentioned knowing anyone named Mark Donovan, or even setting foot in a place like this. Lily stared at the photo for what felt like an eternity, her mind racing with questions. Who was this man? Was it really David? If so, why had he never told her about this connection? And why did Mark Donovan look so happy in the picture, only to now live such a cold, isolated existence? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps echoing in the hallway outside. Quickly, she slid the photo back onto the shelf and turned away, pretending to dust a nearby bookcase. Moments later, Mrs. Carter appeared in the doorway, her arms crossed. "Time for your break," she announced stiffly. "Don't dawdle." As Lily followed Mrs. Carter out of the library, her mind buzzed with possibilities. This mansion held secrets, she realized, and somehow, they were tied to her past. Whatever answers lay hidden within these walls, she was determined to uncover them. Because deep down, she couldn't shake the feeling that her late husband's story wasn't finished yet. Not completely. Lily couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. Even as she scrubbed the marble floors of the grand hallway, her mind kept circling back to those two men smiling together in happier times, or at least, what seemed like happier times. The resemblance between the man in the photo and her late husband, David, was uncanny. It wasn't just a passing similarity, it was as if they were the same person. But how could that be? David had never mentioned Mark Donovan or this mansion. He'd been an ordinary guy with an ordinary life, working construction, playing catch with Tyler on weekends, and telling silly jokes over dinner. Still, the questions gnawed at her. Should she confront Mark? What would she even say? "Excuse me, Mr. Donovan, but did you happen to know my dead husband?" She shook her head at the absurdity of it. Mark didn't strike her as the kind of man who welcomed personal conversations. From what little she'd seen of him so far, he was distant, cold, almost robotic. He moved through the mansion like a ghost, his sharp suits and polished shoes making no sound against the hardwood floors. His presence demanded respect, or maybe fear, but not warmth. And yet, there was something undeniably broken about him too, something hidden beneath his stoic exterior. Mark's routine only reinforced that impression. Every morning, he disappeared into his study for hours, emerging only to attend business meetings via video calls in the library. His meals were eaten alone, in silence, often left half-finished on the dining table. Once, Lily caught a glimpse of him standing by the window in the evening, staring out at the sprawling gardens below. His expression was unreadable, but his shoulders sagged slightly, as though carrying a weight too heavy to bear. There was no laughter in this house, no joy. Just the ticking of clocks and the faint hum of electricity running through the walls. Meanwhile, Tyler was growing restless. Stuck in the East Wing while his mom worked, he spent most of his time exploring every nook and cranny of the mansion. The place fascinated him, the creaky floorboards, the dusty old books, the strange artifacts tucked away in forgotten corners. One afternoon, as he wandered near the kitchen, he overheard Lily talking quietly to Mrs. Carter during her break. "I don't know what to do," Lily admitted, glancing around nervously to make sure no one else was listening. "That photo, it looks exactly like David. I can't ignore it." Tyler froze mid-step, his curiosity piqued. A photo? Who looked like David? Why hadn't Mom told him about it? Determined to find out more, he waited until later that evening when everyone was busy. While Lily cleaned upstairs and Mrs. Carter supervised the other staff, Tyler slipped away and headed straight for the library where he'd once seen his mom dusting some shelves. The room felt different now, quieter somehow, as though the mansion itself was holding its breath. Tyler tiptoed past towering bookcases filled with leather-bound volumes until he reached the shelf where Lily had found the photo earlier. Sure enough, it was still there, lying face down amidst a row of dusty frames. Carefully, he picked it up and turned it over. His eyes widened. The man next to Mark did look like his dad, same smile, same messy hair. How could that be? Before he could think twice, Tyler heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Panicking, he stuffed the photo into his pocket and darted behind a large armchair, heart pounding. To his relief, the footsteps passed without stopping. But now he had a problem. What should he do with the photo? He decided to take it to Mark himself. Maybe Mark could explain why someone who looked so much like Dad was in his picture. Later that night, after dinner, Tyler spotted Mark sitting alone in the living room, scrolling through documents on his laptop. Summoning all his courage, Tyler walked up to him and held out the photo. "Mr. Donovan," he said hesitantly. "I found this. Do you know who this is?" Mark looked up, startled. For a moment, he simply stared at the boy, his face unreadable. Then his gaze dropped to the photo in Tyler's hand, and everything changed. His eyes widened in shock, his fingers trembling as he reached out to take it. He stared at the image for what felt like an eternity, his breathing shallow, his jaw clenched tight. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his tone sharp, almost accusatory. Tyler flinched but managed to answer. "In the library. My mom found it earlier. She thought it looked like my dad." Mark's reaction was immediate and intense. He stood abruptly, nearly knocking over the coffee table. "Your dad?" he stammered, his composure cracking for the first time since Tyler had met him. He studied the boy more closely now, noticing the familiar shape of his eyes, the curve of his smile. Something inside him seemed to shift, though Tyler couldn't quite understand what it meant. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them crackled with unspoken questions and buried truths. Mark finally broke the silence, his voice low and strained. "Leave this with me," he said, taking the photo gently from Tyler's hand. "And tell your mother, we need to talk." As Tyler hurried back to find Lily, Mark sank back into his chair, gripping the photo tightly. Memories he'd tried so hard to bury came flooding back, threatening to overwhelm him. Whoever this woman and her son were, they had stumbled upon a secret he'd kept hidden for years, a secret that might change all their lives forever. The next morning, the air in the Donovan estate felt heavier than usual. Lily had barely slept, her mind racing with questions after Tyler told her about his encounter with Mark. She couldn't shake the image of Mark's face, his shock, his confusion, and then that flicker of something deeper, something almost painful. Whatever this secret was, it wasn't just about a photograph. It ran far deeper, and Lily knew she couldn't avoid confronting him any longer. Mark summoned her to his study shortly after breakfast. When she entered, he was standing by the window, his back to her, staring out at the mist-covered gardens. The room smelled faintly of leather and old books, its heavy mahogany furniture casting long shadows across the floor. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Mark turned to face her, his expression unreadable but his eyes sharp and piercing. "Mrs. Harris," he began, his tone clipped but controlled. "My son showed me a photograph last night. I need to know where you found it." Lily swallowed hard, clutching the edge of her apron nervously. I found it in the library, on one of the shelves. It was dusty, like it hadn't been touched in years." She hesitated, searching his face for some sign of recognition or understanding. "But, there's something else you should know. That man in the photo, the one standing next to you, he's my husband. Or rather, he was my husband. His name is David Harris." Mark froze, his body going rigid as though struck by lightning. He stared at her, his jaw tightening, his fingers gripping the windowsill behind him. "David," he repeated, his voice barely audible. "Are you saying David Harris is your husband?" She nodded slowly, her heart pounding. "Yes. He passed away 3 years ago. But I don't understand, how do you know him?" Why does he look so happy with you in that picture? And why have I never heard his name mentioned before now? For a long moment, Mark didn't answer. He turned away from her again, running a hand through his hair as if trying to collect himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and strained, weighed down by memories he'd clearly tried to bury. David and I, he started, pausing to take a deep breath. We were best friends. Closer than brothers, once upon a time. We grew up together, went to college together, built our careers side by side. He was the only person who truly understood me, the only one I ever let in. His voice cracked slightly, betraying the emotions he usually kept locked away. But then, things changed. Life pulled us in different directions. We lost touch. Years went by without hearing a word from him. I assumed he moved on, started a new life somewhere else. I had no idea he'd gotten married, or that he'd died. Lily listened intently, her chest tightening with every word. There was a raw vulnerability in Mark's voice that she hadn't expected, a glimpse of the man beneath the cold exterior. But even so, something still didn't add up. If you two were so close, she pressed gently, why wouldn't he ever mention you? Not once in all the years we were together did he talk about you, or this place. Mark sighed deeply, sinking into the chair behind his desk. He looked older now, the weight of his past etched into the lines around his eyes. It's complicated, he admitted. After college, David and I co-founded a business together, a tech startup that eventually became wildly successful. But success came at a cost. We clashed over decisions, over priorities. Our friendship, it fractured under the pressure. By the time we parted ways, we weren't speaking to each other. I thought he hated me. His confession hung in the air between them, heavy and unresolved. Lily felt a pang of sympathy for him, but also frustration, for herself, for David, for everything left unsaid. So you just stopped looking for him? She asked, her voice trembling slightly. You didn't try to reach out, to fix things? I wanted to, Mark replied quietly, his gaze dropping to the desk. But pride got in the way. And fear. I convinced myself it was better to let him go. Easier. He shook his head bitterly. Clearly, I was wrong. The silence that followed was suffocating. Lily could feel the emotional tension pressing down on her, squeezing the breath from her lungs. She wanted to believe him, to think that David's silence had been rooted in pain rather than indifference, but part of her couldn't help wondering if there was more to the story. Had David really walked away from Mark entirely? Or had something else driven them apart? As if sensing her doubt, Mark leaned forward, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that startled her. I need to know, he said urgently. What happened to him? How did he die? Lily hesitated, unsure how much to share. But something in Mark's expression, the desperation, the guilt, made her decide to tell him the truth. It was a car accident, she said softly. He was driving home late one night, and another driver ran a red light. He didn't make it. Mark closed his eyes, his shoulders slumping as though the weight of the world had settled onto them. I see, he murmured, his voice hollow. And Tyler, your son. Is he? Yes, Lily interrupted, her own voice breaking slightly. Tyler is David's son. Which means, she trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. But they both knew what she meant. Tyler was also Mark's godson, or at least, he would have been, if David and Mark had stayed close. The realization hit them both like a tidal wave, washing away the walls they'd built around themselves. In that moment, the mansion no longer felt quite so empty. Instead, it seemed filled with echoes of the past, and the faint promise of reconciliation. As Lily stood in Mark's study, watching him wrestle with the weight of his past, she couldn't help but notice how much older he seemed now. The cold, distant billionaire she'd first encountered was gone, or at least, buried beneath layers of regret and sorrow. For the first time, she saw him as a man who had loved deeply, lost tragically, and spent years trying to outrun the pain. Mark leaned back in his chair, staring at the photograph on his desk. His fingers traced the edges of the frame, lingering over David's face. Memories flooded his mind, vivid and unrelenting, pulling him back to a time when life had been simpler and happier. He remembered college days, late-night study sessions fueled by cheap coffee and laughter. He and David had been inseparable then, two ambitious young men with dreams bigger than themselves. They'd shared dorm rooms, meals, and endless conversations about the future. Mark could still picture David sitting cross-legged on the floor, sketching out business ideas on scraps of paper while cracking jokes that made everyone laugh. Even in those early days, David had possessed a warmth and charisma that drew people in, qualities Mark admired but could never quite replicate himself. Their friendship only grew stronger after graduation. Together, they founded Donovan Tech, pouring every ounce of energy into building something extraordinary. Those were golden years, filled with late nights in the office, celebratory dinners after closing deals, and quiet moments of camaraderie when the world felt like it belonged solely to them. Mark smiled faintly at the memory of one particular evening, the night they secured their first major investor. David had insisted they celebrate with burgers and milkshakes at a dingy diner downtown. "We'll look back on this someday," David had said, raising his glass of soda in a mock toast. "And we'll say, this is where it all began." But success came at a cost. As Donovan Tech grew, so did the pressure. Mark threw himself into work, consumed by ambition and the need to prove himself. Meetings stretched late into the night, weekends blurred into weekdays. Slowly but surely, the balance between work and friendship tipped, leaving David behind. At first, David tried to pull him back, reminding him of the importance of family, friends, and living a full life. But Mark brushed him off, dismissing his concerns as naive or overly sentimental. The breaking point came during a heated argument over the company's direction. Voices rose, tempers flared, and words were exchanged that neither man could take back. "You've changed, Mark," David had said bitterly, shaking his head. "I don't even recognize you anymore." And with that, he walked out of the office, and out of Mark's life. Mark hadn't realized it at the time, but that was the last time he ever saw David. Afterward, he convinced himself that moving on was for the best. He buried himself in work, building an empire while shutting out anyone who tried to get close. Over the years, he told himself that David must have done the same, that he'd started a new life, found happiness elsewhere. But deep down, Mark carried the guilt of what he'd done, the rift he'd allowed to widen until it became insurmountable. Now, sitting across from Lily, that guilt threatened to consume him entirely. "I didn't know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "I didn't know he was gone. If I'd known," he trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. Tears welled in his eyes, though he fought to hold them back. "All these years, I thought he hated me. I thought he wanted nothing to do with me. But now," his voice broke. "Now I realize I was the one who pushed him away." Lily watched him silently, her heart aching for both men. She wanted to comfort him, to tell him that David had always spoken fondly of his college years, of the adventures they'd shared before everything fell apart. But she hesitated, unsure whether revealing too much would do more harm than good. David's final years had been difficult. After leaving Donovan Tech, he struggled to find stable work, bouncing from job to job while supporting Lily and Tyler. There were times when money was tight, when stress wore him thin, but he never complained. Instead, he poured his love into his family, finding joy in the little things, Tyler's laughter, Lily's smile, the simple pleasure of being together. Even in his darkest moments, he remained hopeful, believing that better days lay ahead. Should she tell Mark all of this? Should she share the truth about David's struggles, his resilience, his unwavering optimism? Or would it only deepen Mark's guilt, forcing him to confront not just the loss of his friend but also the opportunities he'd missed to reconnect? She decided to tread carefully. David was a remarkable man, she said softly, choosing her words with care. He worked hard, loved fiercely, and never gave up, even when life got tough. He talked about his college days sometimes, about the friends he'd made and the dreams he'd chased. You were a big part of that, Mark. Whether you knew it or not, he still cared about you. Mark looked at her, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. Thank you, he murmured, his voice barely audible. For telling me. For letting me know that he didn't hate me. The room fell silent again, the weight of their shared grief hanging heavy in the air. Outside, the wind rustled through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of laughter that might have belonged to David, or perhaps to the younger versions of themselves, frozen in time. For the first time in years, Mark allowed himself to feel the full force of his emotions, to grieve for the friend he'd lost, the bond he'd broken, and the years they'd never get back. And though the pain was sharp and unrelenting, it was also cleansing, washing away the walls he'd built around his heart. As Lily left the study, closing the door quietly behind her, she couldn't help but wonder if this moment marked the beginning of something new, not just for Mark, but for all of them. In the days that followed, something unexpected began to unfold within the walls of the Donovan estate. Mark, who had always kept everyone at arm's length, started spending more time with Tyler. It wasn't planned or deliberate, at first, it was just small moments. Tyler would wander into the library while Mark worked, asking questions about the books stacked on the shelves. Or he'd tag along during Mark's evening walks through the gardens, peppering him with stories about school, baseball games, and his dreams of becoming an astronaut. At first, Mark seemed unsure how to handle the boy's curiosity and energy. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began to soften. There was something about Tyler, his boundless enthusiasm, his wide-eyed wonder, that reminded Mark of himself at that age. More than anything, though, Tyler reminded him of David. The way the boy tilted his head when he asked a question, the lopsided grin he flashed when he was proud of himself, it was as if David had stepped out of the past and into the present, alive again in his son. One afternoon, as they sat together on the patio overlooking the sprawling lawn, Tyler held up a toy airplane he'd brought from home. "Wanna see it fly?" he asked eagerly, already winding up for a throw. Mark chuckled despite himself. "Sure. Let's see what you've got." The plane soared through the air, wobbling slightly before landing in a patch of grass. Tyler cheered triumphantly, turning back to Mark with a grin. "Pretty cool, huh?" "Not bad," Mark replied, nodding approvingly. Then, after a pause, he added, "You know, your dad used to love planes too. He always talked about flying one someday." Tyler's eyes lit up. "Really? Mom never told me that." "She probably didn't think to," Mark said softly, his gaze drifting toward the horizon. For a moment, he looked lost in thought, as though recalling a memory too precious to share. While Mark and Tyler were forging their tentative bond, Lily found herself drawn deeper into the mystery of David's past. Late at night, after Tyler was asleep and the mansion grew quiet, she sifted through boxes of David's old belongings stored in the attic of their apartment. She hadn't touched these things since his death, too afraid of reopening old wounds. But now, driven by a need to understand the connection between David and Mark, she couldn't ignore them any longer. Among faded photographs, concert tickets, and childhood mementos, she discovered a small wooden box tucked beneath a stack of journals. Inside, she found a single envelope addressed to Mark Donovan. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened it carefully, unfolding the letter inside. The handwriting was unmistakably David's, messy but heartfelt. "Dear Mark. I don't even know where to start. It's been years since we last spoke, and I'm not sure you'd want to hear from me anyway. But there are things I need to say, things I should have said a long time ago, **. I miss you, man. I miss the way we used to dream big and laugh until our sides hurt. I miss the person I was when I was with you, the guy who believed anything was possible. Somewhere along the way, we let life get in the way. We let pride and ambition drive us apart, and I'll always regret that, asterisk. Asterisk. I hope you're happy, wherever you are. I hope you found peace. As for me, I've built a new life, a family. My wife, Lily, is amazing, and my son, Tyler, is the light of my life. They remind me every day of what truly matters: love, laughter, and being present for the people who matter most, asterisk. Asterisk. If you ever read this, I just want you to know that none of what happened between us changes how much I valued our friendship. You were like a brother to me, Mark. And maybe someday we can find our way back to each other, asterisk. Asterisk. Take care. David, asterisk. Tears blurred Lily's vision as she read the letter over and over again. It was clear that David had written it near the end of his life, perhaps hoping to reach out to Mark but never finding the courage to send it. The words were filled with longing, regret, and forgiveness, a final attempt to mend the broken bridge between them. Lily folded the letter carefully, her hands trembling. Should she give it to Mark? Part of her wanted to, knowing it might bring him closure. But another part feared it would only reopen old wounds, forcing him to confront emotions he wasn't ready to face. She spent hours pacing the tiny attic, weighing her options. On one hand, the letter was proof that David had never stopped caring about Mark, not really. It could help Mark heal, show him that their friendship had meant as much to David as it did to him. On the other hand, sharing it felt like an intrusion, like exposing a private moment meant only for Mark's eyes. Finally, exhausted and overwhelmed, she tucked the letter back into the box and carried it downstairs. Sitting alone in the dim glow of a bedside lamp, she stared at the envelope, torn between duty and doubt. What would David want me to do? She whispered aloud, clutching the letter tightly. The storm of emotions swirling inside her refused to settle. For now, she decided to keep the letter hidden, at least until she could figure out the right thing to say, or whether to say anything at all. Meanwhile, outside the window, the first drops of rain began to fall, tapping gently against the glass. The mansion loomed silently in the distance, its secrets still buried deep within its walls. The rain that had begun earlier in the evening continued to fall steadily, turning the Donovan Estates gardens into a slippery maze of wet grass and puddles. Tyler, undeterred by the weather, had been playing outside with his toy airplane, pretending it was soaring through storm clouds. Lily had warned him to stay close to the house, but curiosity got the better of him, and he ventured farther than he should have. It happened in an instant. As Tyler ran after his plane, his foot caught on a loose stone hidden beneath the soggy ground. He stumbled, landing hard on the slick pavement near the fountain. The sharp cry that followed sent a jolt of panic through the mansion. Mark heard it first. He'd been in his study, staring out at the rain-soaked gardens while nursing a glass of whiskey, a habit he'd picked up during lonely nights. At the sound of Tyler's scream, he bolted upright, nearly knocking over the chair as he rushed toward the door. By the time he reached the boy, Lily was already kneeling beside him, her face pale with worry. "Tyler," she exclaimed, gently inspecting his leg. "Are you okay? Does it hurt?" "It's my ankle," Tyler whimpered, tears streaming down his cheeks. "I think I twisted it." Without hesitation, Mark knelt down beside them, his usual composure replaced by raw concern. "Let me help," he said firmly, scooping the boy into his arms before Lily could protest. Tyler clung to him instinctively, burying his face against Mark's shoulder as they hurried inside. The warmth of the mansion enveloped them as Mark carried Tyler to the living room, laying him carefully on the couch. His movements were precise, almost tender, as he removed Tyler's shoe and examined the swelling ankle. "We'll get some ice for this," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And if it doesn't improve, we'll take him to see a doctor." Lily watched in stunned silence, amazed by the transformation she saw in Mark. Gone was the cold, distant man who had hired her weeks ago. In his place stood someone entirely different, someone who cared deeply, even if he didn't always know how to show it. As Mark fetched an ice pack from the kitchen, Tyler looked up at Lily, his eyes still glistening with tears. "He's really nice, Mom," he whispered, gesturing weakly toward Mark. Like Dad used to be." Lily smiled softly, brushing a strand of damp hair from Tyler's forehead. "Yeah, sweetie. He is." That night, after Tyler had fallen asleep on the couch, lulled by the rhythmic patter of rain against the windows, Mark lingered in the living room. He sat in the armchair opposite the couch, watching the boy sleep, his expression unreadable but heavy with thought. For the first time in years, he felt something stir within him, a flicker of purpose, of connection. Lily joined him quietly, pulling a blanket over Tyler before sitting down nearby. Neither of them spoke for a long moment. The only sounds were the soft hum of the fireplace and the occasional crackle of burning logs. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "He reminds me so much of David," he admitted, his voice low and tinged with emotion. "Not just in the way he looks, but in the way he sees the world, with wonder, with hope. It's remarkable." Lily nodded, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his tone. She wanted to tell him about the letter, to share the words David had written but never sent. But the timing didn't feel right, not yet. Instead, she simply said, "David would have loved seeing you two together. He always hoped you'd reconnect someday." Mark glanced at her sharply, surprised by her insight. Then, without another word, he stood and left the room, retreating to his study. Later that night, as the mansion grew quiet and the rain tapered off, Lily made her decision. She retrieved the letter from its hiding place and crept silently to Mark's desk. Placing it there, she hesitated for a moment, her hand hovering over the envelope. What if reading it caused him more pain? What if it pushed him further away instead of bringing him closer? But then she remembered David's words, the regret, the longing, the love that had driven him to write the letter in the first place. If anyone deserved closure, it was Mark. With a deep breath, she stepped back and closed the door behind her, leaving the choice in his hands. Back in his study, Mark poured himself another drink, staring absently at the dark liquid swirling in the glass. His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, guilt, grief, gratitude, all tangled together in ways he couldn't untangle. When his gaze landed on the envelope lying innocently on his desk, his heart skipped a beat. For several minutes, he simply stared at it, unsure whether to open it or leave it untouched. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, heavier than anything he'd faced in years. But eventually, curiosity, and perhaps a sliver of hope, won out. With trembling fingers, he picked up the letter and turned it over. The handwriting was unmistakably David's. Slowly, he unfolded it and began to read. Each word hit him like a wave, washing away layers of bitterness and regret. By the time he reached the end, tears streamed freely down his face. For the first time in decades, he allowed himself to grieve, not just for David, but for the friendship they'd lost, the years wasted to pride and fear. When he finally set the letter down, his chest felt lighter, as though a burden he'd carried for far too long had finally lifted. Outside, the clouds parted, revealing a sliver of moonlight that spilled through the window and illuminated the room. In that moment, Mark realized something important. The past couldn't be changed, but the future was still unwritten. And maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to start healing, to rebuild what had been broken, one step at a time. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock on Mark's desk. He sat motionless in his chair, the letter clutched tightly in his hands as though it might slip away if he let go. David's words lingered in the air around him, each sentence etched into his mind like a scar that refused to fade. I miss you, man. I miss the way we used to dream big and laugh until our sides hurt. Mark closed his eyes, trying to steady his breathing, but the weight of those words pressed down on him relentlessly. He could almost hear David's voice, warm, familiar, full of life, as though his old friend were sitting right there beside him. For years, Mark had convinced himself that their friendship had ended because David no longer cared. But now, reading this letter, he understood the truth: David had wanted to reconnect. It was Mark who had built the walls, not David. Tears streamed unchecked down his face as he read the final lines again. If you ever read this, I just want you to know that none of what happened between us changes how much I valued our friendship. You were like a brother to me, Mark. And maybe someday we can find our way back to each other. Mark's chest tightened, a mix of regret and gratitude swelling inside him. Gratitude because David had never stopped caring. Regret because he hadn't been brave enough to reach out first. All those wasted years, all the moments they could have shared, the laughter, the memories, they were gone forever. But then, something shifted within him. As he sat there in the dim light of his study, surrounded by the ghosts of his past, Mark realized he couldn't undo what had been done. What he could do, however, was honor David's memory. He owed it to his friend, not just for the bond they'd once shared, but for the lessons David had taught him about love, family, and being present for the people who mattered most. Slowly, deliberately, Mark stood up. His legs felt unsteady beneath him, weighed down by the emotions coursing through his body. But his resolve was firm. For too long, he had lived in isolation, shutting out the world and burying himself in work. No more. He walked over to the window and pulled back the heavy curtains, letting moonlight spill into the room. Outside, the rain had stopped, leaving the gardens glistening under a blanket of stars. The mansion, which had always felt cold and empty, suddenly seemed alive with possibility. By morning, Mark had made his decision. After dressing quickly, he called Lily into his office. She arrived cautiously, unsure what to expect after last night's events. When she entered, she found him standing by the fireplace, his posture unusually relaxed yet determined. "Lily," he began, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions still swirling inside him. "I've been thinking about everything, about David, about Tyler, about my life. And I've come to realize something important." She nodded silently, encouraging him to continue. "For years, I've lived behind these walls, hiding from the world, and from myself. I let pride and fear dictate my choices, and in doing so, I lost sight of what truly matters. But David reminded me, through this letter, through Tyler, that life isn't about building empires or chasing success. It's about connection. About love. About making a difference." Lily listened intently, her heart swelling with hope. This wasn't the same man who had hired her weeks ago. This was someone new, someone willing to confront his pain and use it to create something meaningful. "I've decided," Mark continued, his tone resolute, "to establish a charity foundation in David's name. Something that will help families like yours, families struggling to make ends meet, children dreaming of brighter futures. I want to honor his memory by giving back to the community, by ensuring that others don't have to face the hardships he endured." Lily's eyes filled with tears. "That's incredible, Mark. David would be so proud of you." Mark smiled faintly, though his expression remained tinged with sadness. "It's long overdue. But better late than never, right?" Over the next few days, Mark threw himself into planning the foundation. He reached out to lawyers, financial advisors, and non-profit organizations, determined to get every detail right. Meanwhile, Lily noticed a profound change in him, not just in his actions, but in his demeanor. The cold, distant billionaire was gone, replaced by a man who laughed more freely, spoke more openly, and embraced the people around him with genuine warmth. One evening, as they sat together in the library discussing ideas for the foundation, Tyler bounded into the room, clutching a drawing he'd made earlier that day. "Look," he exclaimed proudly, holding it up for them to see. "It's the foundation logo. I drew it myself." The picture showed a bright sun rising over a city skyline, with stick figures holding hands beneath it. Beneath the image, Tyler had scrawled in bold letters, David's Hope Foundation. Mark stared at the drawing, his throat tightening with emotion. Then, without a word, he knelt down and pulled Tyler into a tight hug. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with gratitude. "This is perfect." As Tyler beamed with pride and Lily looked on with tears in her eyes, Mark felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, he knew that, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. David's legacy would live on, not just in memories, but in the lives of those touched by the foundation. And perhaps, in helping others heal, Mark would finally begin to heal himself. The Donovan estate was no longer the cold, silent fortress it had once been. In the weeks following Mark's decision to create the David's Hope Foundation, the mansion transformed into a place of warmth, laughter, and purpose. What had once been empty halls and unused rooms now buzzed with activity, children playing tag in the gardens, volunteers setting up classrooms in the East Wing, and families gathering for workshops and community events. The air carried the faint hum of conversation and occasional bursts of giggles, filling every corner of the house with life. Lily stood in the grand foyer one morning, watching as a group of kids ran past her, their sneakers squeaking against the polished marble floors. She smiled, shaking her head slightly at the chaos, but it was a good kind of chaos. For years, she'd worked tirelessly to provide for Tyler, often feeling overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility. Now, standing here in this vibrant, bustling home, she felt something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. Mark appeared beside her, his suit jacket slung casually over one shoulder. He looked more relaxed than ever, his tie loosened and his sleeves rolled up, a stark contrast to the rigid businessman who had hired her just months ago. "It's amazing, isn't it?" he said, nodding toward the children chasing each other around the staircase. "It really is," Lily replied, her voice soft but filled with admiration. "You've done so much already, Mark. David would be proud." Mark glanced at her, a flicker of vulnerability passing across his face before he masked it with a small smile. "I couldn't have done it without you, or Tyler," he admitted. "You both reminded me what it means to care about people again." Before Lily could respond, Tyler came barreling into the room, his cheeks flushed from running. "Mom! Mr. Donovan! Look what I made," he exclaimed, holding up a colorful poster covered in glitter and stickers. Across the top, he'd written in bold letters, "Welcome to David's Hope." "That's fantastic, Tyler," Mark said, kneeling down to get a closer look. "We'll hang it right here in the entryway so everyone can see it when they come in." Tyler grinned ear to ear, clearly thrilled by the idea. As Mark helped him tape the poster to the wall, Lily watched them quietly, her heart swelling with emotion. Over the past few weeks, she'd seen a remarkable change in both of them. Mark had stepped into a role she never expected. He wasn't just a mentor or benefactor to Tyler, he was becoming a father figure, someone the boy admired and trusted completely. And Tyler, in turn, had brought out a side of Mark that few people had ever seen: gentle, playful, and deeply caring. Later that afternoon, Mark called Lily into his study. The room still bore traces of its former self, the mahogany desk, the towering bookshelves, but now it felt different, warmer somehow. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating stacks of papers and blueprints spread across the desk. "I wanted to talk to you about something important," Mark began, gesturing for her to sit. When she did, he leaned forward, his expression serious but kind. "As you know, we're expanding the foundation quickly. We'll need strong leadership to keep everything running smoothly. And, well, I can't think of anyone better suited for the job than you." Lily blinked in surprise. "Me? You want me to lead the foundation?" Yes, Mark replied firmly. You understand the struggles these families face because you've lived them. You're compassionate, hardworking, and incredibly resourceful. Plus, he hesitated, a hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. You've already proven you can handle me on my worst days. Lily laughed softly, touched by his confidence in her. Thank you, Mark. I don't even know what to say. Of course, I'll do it, but only if you promise to stick around and help too. Deal, he said, extending his hand. When their fingers brushed briefly during the handshake, an unspoken connection passed between them, a spark neither of them acknowledged but both felt. Over the next few days, Lily threw herself into her new role, working closely with Mark to organize programs, secure funding, and recruit volunteers. Their partnership grew stronger with each passing day, built on mutual respect and shared goals. But beneath the surface, something else was blossoming, something neither of them dared to name. One evening, after most of the staff and volunteers had gone home, Lily found herself alone in the kitchen preparing dinner for Tyler. Mark wandered in, drawn by the smell of garlic and herbs wafting through the air. Something smells incredible, he said, leaning against the counter as he watched her stir a pot of pasta sauce. It's nothing fancy, Lily replied with a shrug, though a blush crept onto her cheeks. Just spaghetti. Tyler loves it. Well, it smells like heaven, Mark teased lightly. Then, after a pause, he added, you know, I've been thinking, this place feels different now. Like it's finally living up to its potential, not just as a house, but as a home. Lily nodded, glancing around the cozy kitchen. It does. And it's because of you, Mark. You opened your doors, and your heart, to all of us. He looked away, embarrassed by the compliment, but his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary. There was something in his eyes, an unspoken gratitude, perhaps, or maybe something deeper. As they stood there together, surrounded by the comforting aroma of dinner and the distant sound of Tyler laughing upstairs, the tension between them grew palpable. Neither said a word, but the silence spoke volumes. They were two people who had been through loss, pain, and hardship, and yet, here they were, finding solace in each other's company. For now, they kept their feelings unspoken, focusing instead on the work ahead. But deep down, they both knew that something extraordinary was beginning to take root, not just in the mansion, but in their hearts. Just as the David's Hope Foundation began to gain momentum, an unexpected storm rolled in, not from the skies, but from the cutthroat world of business. A rival businessman named Richard Grayson, who had long envied Mark's success, saw the foundation as a vulnerability, a crack in the armor of the once unstoppable Mark Donovan. To Grayson, charity was a sign of weakness, and he seized the opportunity to exploit it. It started subtly at first, whispers in boardrooms, articles questioning Mark's motives, rumors spreading about financial instability within Donovan Tech. But soon, the attacks grew bolder. One morning, Mark arrived at the mansion to find a stack of legal notices on his desk, lawsuits filed by Grayson's company, alleging that funds meant for Donovan Tech shareholders were being diverted to support the foundation. Lily noticed the change in him immediately. Gone was the warmth and optimism she'd come to admire, in its place was the cold, calculating man she'd first met. He spent hours locked away in his study, poring over documents and making frantic phone calls to lawyers. The laughter and joy that had filled the mansion began to fade, replaced by a suffocating tension. Mark, Lily said one evening, finding him slumped in his chair, staring blankly at the fireplace. You can't let him win. He looked up, exhaustion etched into every line of his face. What choice do I have, Lily? If I fight back, it'll only make things worse. And if I don't, everything we've built here could collapse. She knelt beside him, her voice firm but gentle. This isn't just about you anymore. It's about the families who depend on this foundation. It's about Tyler, and all the kids like him who need hope. You didn't start this journey to protect your reputation, you did it because it was the right thing to do. Don't lose sight of that now. Her words struck a chord deep within him. For a moment, he simply stared at her, seeing not just the determined woman before him, but also the reflection of David's values, the same values that had inspired him to create the foundation in the first place. "You're right," he said finally, his voice steadying. "Grayson wants me to crumble under pressure, to go back to being the man I used to be. But I'm not that person anymore. Not anymore." The next day, Mark held a press conference outside the mansion, flanked by Lily, Tyler, and several families who had benefited from the foundation. Cameras flashed as reporters fired questions, their skepticism palpable. But Mark stood tall, his expression resolute. "I won't deny that there are challenges ahead," he began, addressing the crowd. "But let me be clear, the David's Hope Foundation is not a weakness, it's my greatest strength. This foundation represents everything I believe in: family, community, and the power of giving back. Mr. Grayson may think he can intimidate me, but he's mistaken. I will defend this foundation, and the people it serves, with everything I have." His speech was met with applause, not just from the families gathered around him, but from the staff and volunteers watching from inside the mansion. Even Lily felt tears welling in her eyes as she realized how far Mark had come, from a man consumed by pride and fear to someone willing to stand up for what truly mattered. That night, after the chaos had settled and the mansion grew quiet, Mark sat with Tyler in the living room. The boy was coloring quietly, humming a tune under his breath. Mark watched him for a moment, his heart swelling with affection. "Tyler," he said softly, drawing the boy's attention. "I've been thinking about your future. About our family." Tyler tilted his head curiously. "Our family?" Mark nodded, his voice thick with emotion. "Yes. Your mom and I, we want to make sure you always have a stable home, a place where you feel safe and loved. So, I'd like to adopt you, officially. If that's okay with you." Tyler's eyes widened in disbelief, then lit up with pure joy. "Really? You mean it?" "Of course," Mark replied, pulling the boy into a tight hug. "You're already like a son to me, Tyler. This would just make it official." As Tyler cheered and ran off to tell Lily the news, Mark leaned back in his chair, feeling a sense of peace wash over him. Adopting Tyler wasn't just about providing the boy with stability, it was about creating a new beginning for himself, too. A chance to build a family rooted in love, trust, and purpose. When Lily entered the room moments later, her face glowing with happiness, Mark stood to meet her. "Thank you," he said simply, his gaze locking onto hers. "For believing in me. For reminding me why I started this journey." Lily smiled, her own emotions threatening to spill over. "We're in this together, Mark. Always." And as they stood there, surrounded by the warmth of the mansion they transformed into a home, both knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. The day of the David's Hope Foundation grand opening dawned bright and clear, with golden sunlight streaming through the windows of the Donovan estate. The mansion buzzed with excitement as volunteers, families, and community members gathered to celebrate not just the launch of the foundation, but the beginning of something far greater, a new chapter for everyone involved. Mark stood at the entrance, greeting guests alongside Lily and Tyler. He wore a suit, but it was different from the ones he used to wear during his corporate days. This one fit more comfortably, almost like a symbol of how much he'd changed. Beside him, Lily looked radiant in a simple yet elegant dress, her smile lighting up the room. And Tyler? Well, Tyler couldn't stop grinning, proudly showing off his adoption papers to anyone who would listen. "This is amazing," Lily whispered to Mark as they watched children run across the lawn, laughing and playing games organized by the volunteers. "You've done so much good here." "It's not just me," Mark replied, glancing at her with a softness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "It's all of us, you, Tyler, everyone who's worked so hard to make this happen. This isn't my victory, it's ours." As the ceremony began, Mark stepped up to the podium to deliver a speech. The crowd fell silent, their attention focused entirely on him. For a moment, he hesitated, looking out at the sea of faces, families whose lives had already begun to change because of the foundation. Then he spoke, his voice steady and heartfelt. "When I started this journey, I thought I was honoring my friend David's memory," he began. "But what I didn't realize was that I was also finding myself again. Through this foundation, I've learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars or possessions, it's measured in love, connection, and second chances. Today, we're not just opening doors to opportunity, we're building a community rooted in hope. And for that, I'll be forever grateful." The applause that followed was thunderous, echoing through the gardens and filling the air with joy. But Mark's surprises weren't over yet. After the speeches ended and the festivities continued, he pulled Lily aside, his expression unusually nervous. "There's something else I want to give you," he said, handing her an envelope. "Open it." Lily hesitated, then carefully unfolded the paper inside. Her breath caught as she read the contents, a deed to a beautiful home nestled in a quiet suburban neighborhood. "Mark, what is this?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's yours," he explained, his tone gentle but firm. "Yours and Tyler's. I wanted to make sure you never have to worry about struggling again. You deserve stability, security, and most importantly, a place to call your own." Tears spilled down Lily's cheeks as she hugged him tightly. "I don't know what to say," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly. "Thank you doesn't even begin to cover it." "You don't have to say anything," Mark replied, returning the hug. "Just promise me one thing, that you'll let me be part of your lives. Not just as Tyler's adoptive father, but as, well, whatever role you'll have me in." Lily pulled back, meeting his gaze with a mix of gratitude and affection. "You already are," she said softly. "Your family, Mark. Whether you like it or not." Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and pink, the three of them sat together on the mansion's sprawling porch. Tyler leaned against Mark, recounting highlights from the day's events, while Lily listened with a contented smile. For Mark, the moment felt surreal. Just months ago, he'd been a man consumed by loneliness and regret, hiding behind walls of wealth and ambition. Now, sitting here with Lily and Tyler, he realized he'd found something far more valuable than anything money could buy, a family. Not one bound by blood, but by choice. By love. As the first stars appeared in the night sky, Tyler yawned sleepily and rested his head on Mark's shoulder. "This is the best day ever," he murmured, his eyelids growing heavy. "It really is," Mark agreed, brushing a strand of hair from Tyler's forehead. Lily reached over, placing a hand on Mark's arm. "We did it," she said quietly. "All of us. Together." Mark nodded, his heart full in a way it had never been before. In that moment, surrounded by laughter, love, and the promise of tomorrow, he knew he'd finally found his purpose, not in success or power, but in the connections that made life worth living. And as the mansion stood silently behind them, its halls no longer cold but alive with memories, it became clear that fate had brought them together for a reason. To heal. To grow. To form a family that would endure long after the sun set on this perfect day. And so, as the sun sets on this story, we're left with a powerful reminder of what truly matters in life. A family formed by fate isn't just a tale about second chances, it's a testament to the idea that love, connection, and purpose can transform even the coldest hearts. Mark Donovan began his journey as a man defined by wealth and isolation, but through loss, regret, and ultimately redemption, he discovered that true fulfillment comes not from success or power, but from the people we choose to share our lives with. Lily taught us resilience, the quiet strength it takes to keep moving forward, even when life feels overwhelming. Tyler reminded us of the boundless joy and hope children bring into our lives, no matter the circumstances. And David, though gone, left behind a legacy of forgiveness and love that bridged the gap between past and present. This story challenges us all to reflect: what walls have we built around ourselves? Who are the people we've let slip away without saying what needs to be said? And how can we use our own gifts, whether big or small, to make the world a little brighter for someone else? If you found yourself moved by this journey, please consider subscribing to our channel. Every story we share is crafted with care, aiming to inspire, challenge, and connect with viewers like you. By joining our community, you won't miss out on the next unforgettable tale, one that might just resonate with your heart in ways you never expected. So don't wait. Hit that subscribe button now, and be part of a growing family of storytellers and dreamers who believe in the power of stories to change lives. Until next time, remember, life's greatest treasures aren't measured in dollars or possessions, they're found in the moments we share, the bridges we build, and the love we give freely. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter.